Stories are what we live by, what we tell ourselves, what we believe is true. What if I told you that you are loved, desired, and you are made with a purpose? You are accepted. You have a precious soul and you have a meaningful body. You are empowered by God Himself to live the rich and abundant life He always wanted for you. You are called into a mission to tell the story of God's love to all the world, and you are destined to be with Him forever. This is the true story of what it means to be a person made in the image of God and living by faith in the Son of God. This is what you are longing for. This is who you really are.
Jesus is His name.
Good morning, everyone. Our bodies are amazing machines. You realize that today, your blood is going to travel 168 million miles today. It's just an incredible machine. Think of all the things we get to enjoy because of our bodies, the feeling of warm water on my skin in the morning shower, or the texture of a great apple, or the smell of fresh baked bread, watching a purple-lined, sky-lined sunset. It's just remarkable. Our bodies are incredible, except, of course, when they're not. Our bodies sometimes don't work. They sometimes don't make sense. No matter what your age, you'll think basically our day-to-day thought is awkward. That's how we feel about our bodies. Our cultural narrative that we've imbibed from the world around us says that you are an accident. And so it's no surprise that so many people look at their bodies the way they look at a scene of an accident. But what if I told you that your body was designed with meaning and purpose and a future? Now, I got to tell you, my sermon this morning is rated PG-13. I've tried very hard to be sensitive, but there's going to be some adult themes and some vocabulary that if my child was between the ages of 5 and 13, I would want a heads up. And so I'm giving you a heads up. So when we come to the sermon time, if for some reason you would rather listen to it later, we have classrooms where you can have private family devotionals. We've got closets where you can get into it and find all kinds of stuff that would make Tony very upset. I bet the deacons would love for you to help them count the money. I mean, whatever you want to do, I just wanted to give you a heads up, but I hope that you'll stay as we talk about the importance of the body. We're going to stand and we're going to read a verse together. If you'll stand with me, we're going to read Philippians 3 and verse 21. And think about the hope that's held together in these words as it connects the things that we don't really understand with the one who showed us who we're going to be. Let's say it together. He will transform our lowly body to be like His glorious body by the power that enables Him even to subject all things to Himself. Thank you. I remember, like it was yesterday, all the children had planned, prepared, practiced. We had a boys training class at church, and it was Sunday night, and we were going to be leading singing. And always the daring one, I was always picking these songs that were very difficult to lead. And I was going to lead Salvation Has Been Brought Down. Now, what I loved about this was I could hit all the notes. And so I wouldn't just sing the Salvation Has Been Brought Down, but the oh glory, well, I would hit that one way up there. And it was always a sight to see. And of course, that's what is the main thing when you lead singing, to be impressive. And so that's what I was trying to do. The problem was, I remembered that weekend, my throat started feeling scratchy. And there were just some things that were different. And I went to lead that song, and we got to Salvation Has Been Brought Down, and I went to hit those high notes, and they weren't there. And I learned in that moment something else had been brought down, And it wasn't just salvation. Bodies are awkward. They're awkward. When you hear the word body in you're an adult, it might bring back those less than great memories of locker rooms. It's just an awkward thing. But it's interesting that in the original story that we've been given by God about how we came to be, there's a story that ends with this interesting verse. And both of them, Adam and Eve, were naked, and they felt no shame. What I see from this verse is a couple of important things, but the first thing that jumps out at me is that we were not intended to see our own bodies as something of which to be ashamed. Do you know what was the first Christian heresy? In the 2nd century, when Christians were trying to figure out how do we avoid false doctrine that's taking over churches, the first big heresy that had to be confronted, the one that took over a lot of churches and then had to be cleaned up, was not that God failed to come to earth as God. You would think that the first Christian heresy was, I like Jesus, but I'm not certain that he was God. That wasn't the first Christian heresy. It wasn't that he was God. It was that he actually came in a body. The idea that was being spread was to be truly spiritual, was to be released from the body. So if God is fully God, and if Jesus was fully spiritual, surely his true self was released before any body died on the cross. This idea that Christ was God in flesh, it's just a hard thing for people to believe. And that happens very strongly in the 2nd century, but you start seeing the seeds of it at the end of the 1st century, because in the book of 2nd John, a very short letter, John says, you've got to be on guard against deceivers and antichrists. And his example of someone who's antichrist is this statement: they don't confess that God came in the flesh. This idea is still in our subconscious. That is, that who we really are is somehow trapped in this really bad thing. And I can't wait until I can shuffle off this mortal coil and truly be me. It's in our minds and it's in our hearts. I mean, think about it. Our bodies don't deliver when it counts. When we're young and strong, we can use our bodies any way we want to, but we're foolish. And so we use them all wrong. And when we get older, we have all the wisdom about how to use our bodies. But when we make the call to the bullpen, our bodies don't want to take the mound. You know the problem as we get older. Some of you are older than me. Some of you have already experienced some things that I know I still have to look forward to. My memory is not what it used to be. I tell people that and they say, don't say that now. Some of you may have experienced something like putting your Dillard's bill in the collection basket by mistake, or noticing, one lady said she noticed that she was wearing mismatched earrings. And so she went home to change, only to discover that she was now wearing the other mismatched earrings. You know, with aging comes a recognition that our brains wear down, our backs wear out, and our bodies are not what we'd like them to be. A survey involving women in their 60s, 37% of women answered yes to the question, are you happy with your body? That means 63% said no. And this isn't just a problem as we get older. It's all across the board. The Mental Health Foundation did an online survey in the UK involving nearly 5,000 people of various ages. More than a third of adults said they felt anxious or depressed because of concerns about their body image. And more than a third of teenagers felt ashamed of their bodies. Now, narrow that down to young women. Surveys show that most teenage girls are not happy with their body. But that starts by asking 13-year-olds. Over 50% of 13-year-old girls said they were unhappy with their bodies. And that number grew as they grew in their teen years. By the time they were 17 years old, that number was 78%. We know where a major source of the problem is, and we think that that may be the solution to our problem. 40% of teenagers said that images they see on social media cause them to worry about their body image. But before we had social media, we had reality television. And before that, I imagine it was soap operas and Cosmo. This isn't something that's confined to a generation with phones. Remember, the body image problem is across the board and with all ages. Our bodies seem like something either bad or at best an inconvenience. They aren't the real me, at least I hope they're not, and they don't represent the best of me. The truth is that the cultural narrative we've imbibed teaches us that our bodies are commodities. And for many of us, they just seem to get in the way. But the Christian origin story says that bodies are sacred and integral to our souls. Do you ever notice that everything you do in the spiritual life involves your body? We use our voices to sing praises to God. We eat and drink the body of Christ. We use our feet to go visit the sick. We use our hands to feed others when they're hungry. In the Bible, people would pray by standing or kneeling or laying down. In fact, ironically, do you know the only posture not given in the New Testament for praying? Sitting down. We do things with our bodies because spirituality is, in fact, a bodily activity as much as it is anything else. Our bodies are part of who we are. And didn't we learn this in 2020? The coronavirus forced all of us to shelter in our homes. And thank God that we had phones and internet, right? I mean, we could Zoom, we could text, we could talk. What more could you ask for? You know what more. We longed for bodies that could hug us, bodies that could hold our hands in prayer. This is part of what God meant when he said on the sixth day of Genesis 1, after saying everything was good, it was after he made humans that he said, this is very good. Tish Warren wrote a book called The Liturgy of the Ordinary, and she wisely said, when we denigrate our bodies, whether through neglect or staring at our faces and counting our flaws, we are belittling a sacred site, a worship space more wondrous than the most glorious ancient cathedral. We are standing before the Grand Canyon or the Sistine Chapel and rolling our eyes. But when we use our bodies for their intended purpose, in gathered worship, raising our hands, or singing, or kneeling, or in an average day, sleeping, or savoring a meal, or jumping, or hiking, or running, it's glorious as a great cathedral being used just as its architect had dreamt it would be. The second thing that jumps out at me from this verse is this. The Christian story says that we weren't supposed to feel shame about other people's bodies. We're supposed to see them as good. Talking about bodies inevitably leads to talking about sex. That's especially true in a culture where we use sex to sell toothpaste and everything else. But I want to use this powerful origin story that says we Christians tell it and we set it against the backdrop of what we're witnessing in our culture. When we hear the word naked, we think of something inappropriate. And that's because of how far we've fallen from this story. I don't have to tell you that pornography is a problem. You know it. Some of you know it all too well. I heard Jonathan Storment give this statistic in a powerful sermon. He said, the average starting age of viewing porn is between the ages of 10 and 11. In fact, the University of Montreal in 2009 tried to do a survey about the effects of pornography on men, but they had to cancel the study because they couldn't find a control group of men who don't view it. According to the study, those men don't exist. If women get the distinct impression that every man they know is looking at images of the perfect body, how do you think women are supposed to feel about their bodies? And I want you to think about that word shame. One of the most interesting books I've read this year is a book by Louise Perry called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. This is not a Christian book. This is a book written by someone who says herself she is a liberal feminist atheist. And what is she saying in her book? She says, do you know what the sexual revolution has produced? Disaster. She says, if you want to see what the sexual revolution has produced, the Gospel of Woodstock, take a look at Hugh Hefner and Marilyn Monroe. That is the story in a nutshell. It has allowed men to treat women as commodities and to abuse them. And it has left women with nothing to show for it. Now, this is a book that my friend Craig Martin, who teaches philosophy at Harding, says has had more impact on his skeptical students than any C.S. Lewis book ever had, because it's written by somebody from the other side saying, we got to get out of this place. You know what she calls for? She said, what we need are long-term, stable relationships based on mutual love. Seems like I heard that somewhere before. Think about this. Think about what's going on in our culture and how we see the world. The Christian story says our bodies and our spirits are intertwined. The Apostle Paul said to the church in Corinth, when you go out and you join your body to a temple prostitute, you're not just exchanging fluids, you're exchanging souls. Church, we've got to do a better job about talking about sex. If we don't teach what our bodies are for, our culture certainly will. I'm convinced, my friend Max Sandlin put it best. He said, we don't know what to do with issues involving sex because we don't understand what sex is. Because we don't understand what sex is because we don't fully grasp what a body is. We think of the body only at the surface level, and we pay no attention to how it touches our souls. I love this quote from John Paul II. The problem with porn has never been that it reveals too much. The problem is that it reveals too little. Those impulses, those urges that you feel in your body, the ones that feel almost uncontrollable, the ones that you think get in the way of your spirituality, those were given to you by God, and He calls them good. What if we could see human bodies the way God sees them? You know, our best intentions sometimes lead to overreactions. Many of you, like me, may have been raised in a situation in which the best of intentions to help keep us pure, all we remember hearing about sex was, don't do it. Don't think that doesn't carry over into your marriage. We focus on the don't lust passages. We forget all about the Song of Solomon. We make jokes all the time about the Song of Solomon, you know, about how it seems misplaced or inappropriate. But God made us sexual beings. He put us in the garden naked and unashamed. And He said, this is good. And I find it amazing that in the Song of Solomon, the author portrays his lover first as sister and then as wife. I remember hearing Christian preachers tell us young kids, if you ever look at a picture you have no business looking at, remember, that's somebody's daughter. Solomon says, I got one more for you. That's my sister. What if we sensed our shared humanity first? And then we sensed, how can the way I and you treat our bodies tell a story, an honest story about a good thing that's God designed? in the right way. But everyone I know agrees that you shouldn't do everything your body tells you. There's not a person I know of who doesn't have some limits on what they think a person should do with their bodies. I was a teenager when I heard a speaker who was very good at what he was doing, and he told the story. He said his motivational speaking became so popular that he got a call from Oprah's talent booking person to maybe have him on the show. And as they were talking, he explained that his motivational speaking was mostly to Christian audiences, mostly to young teenagers, mostly to try to teach them something about their bodies and sex. And the lady on the phone said, "Tell me what you think about sex." And he said, "Well, I think it's a gift from God to be reserved for marriage." And she said, "Oh, well, that's a shame. See, I can't book you because Oprah believes that you're talking about something that is natural. And to put restrictions on something that is natural would not be a good fit on that show." And he said, "Oh, really? I got a question. Does Oprah have a dog?" She said, yeah, Oprah has a dog." He said, "It's interesting. Does Oprah let that dog pee all over the couch?" She said, "Of course not." He said, "Oh, really? Isn't that natural?" In other words, don't we all recognize there are limits on what we think we can do with our bodies and what you should do with your body? Of course we do. Everybody has a limit somewhere. The question is, what is driving the narrative of what you think your body is and who controls it? I have a 20-month-old, and there are all sorts of things she wants to do that I won't let her do. There's things I don't want her to do because I don't believe they're good for her. And I consider it my responsibility to help train her to act in appropriate ways. The Christian story says you are not your own. You've been bought with a price. And that language of bought is the language of bought back because we had fallen into something. And the language in the New Testament is that we had found ourselves enslaved. This is the doctrine of the fall, that we have become slaves to something called sin. You remember that God made Adam and Eve, and they were naked, and they felt no shame. But fast forward just one chapter, and the text says, their eyes were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And when God comes walking through the garden, he's looking for them, and he says, "Where are you?" And Adam says, "I heard you walking in the cool of the day, but I was naked and I was afraid, so I hid myself." And then God says, "Who told you that you were naked?" The point of that little narrative is that shame has entered the scene. Selfishness, what I think about my own body rather than how it serves you. And what I think about your body in terms of how it serves my immature desires has set in. And now, this is not good. What happened between these two stories? Well, the answer is we fell. I have no doubt that it looked like progress. Freedom always disguises itself first as progress, but it was regression. And this is because, as Paul puts it, we're all slaves to something. We so often think that freedom from some dominating authority means freedom. It doesn't. It simply means slavery to something else. And no one is more trapped than he who thinks he is dominated by nothing. In Romans 6, Paul says, "Don't let sin control the way you live. Don't give in to sinful desires. Don't let any part of your body become an instrument of evil to serve sin. Instead, give yourselves completely to God. For you were dead, but now you have new life. So use your whole body as an instrument to do what is right for the glory of God. Sin is no longer your master, for you no longer live under the requirements of the law. Instead, you live under the freedom of God's grace." This is a truth. We're all under the control of something or someone. And the question is, to whom will we give ultimate allegiance? Paul actually says at the end of Romans 8, every athlete is disciplined in their training. They want to win the prize. And so I discipline my body, lest after preaching to others, I myself become disqualified. And so Paul uses the language of offering or presenting of a sacrifice in Romans 12 and verse 1. Yes, he's going to talk about renewing your mind. But before he gets to renewing your mind, he talks about your body. I appeal to you, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. James Bryan Smith has a great line. He says, living bodies don't want to be sacrificed. They tend to crawl off the altar. Paul here says, you can willingly choose who controls your body. Maybe you remember Paul's letter to the Philippians, written from a prison cell, where he's shackled either to the wall or to a guard. There's no telling what he looked like. There's no telling what he smelled like. And yet Paul says this, it's my eager expectation and hope that I will not have any shame, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. If I die, may my dead body show the results of having lived for Christ. And if I live, may my life be a living sacrifice that brings glory and honor to God. I have a question for you. When you think about what you do with your body, would your answer be different if you truly believed your body has a future? In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says one of the things that sets Christianity apart from the pagan Greek cults of the day is that while they all believe in immortal souls, we Christians believe in the resurrection of the body. Now, we believe that Jesus Christ had a body. You remember this passage in John 1 and verse 14. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. To even get more gritty, in 1 John chapter 1 and verse 1, the writer says, that which we have seen with our eyes, which we've looked upon, which our hands have handled concerning the word of life. We smelled his sweat. We held his hands. We felt the markings in his fingers. We put our fingers into his side. A real body. We know that. We know that Christ had a body. But it's amazing to me that in 1 Corinthians 15, when Paul begins by saying it's so important that you believe that Christ rose from the dead, it's not just because he's the linchpin for our belief in the resurrection, but that he is the launching pad for our belief in our future resurrection. A teenager in this church asked a question in a question box and asked, where do we go when we die? That is a great question. After all of my schooling, let me give you my best answer right now. I'm not entirely sure. Some Christians believe that you go to a place called paradise, which is a nice place, until the judgment day, at which point some stay nice and some do not. That's based on the language of Jesus at the cross. Some believe you go to a waiting place, which basically tells you where you're going to be after Judgment Day, based upon the story of the rich man and Lazarus. Others believe your soul goes into something called soul sleep. Have you ever gone to sleep and you thought that you were asleep for 8 minutes, but it turns out it was 8 hours? The argument there is what seems like eternity for us is only a second for you after you die, so that after you die, when you wake up, you're at the resurrection. Listen, I don't know. Here's what I do know. I know that we are kept in the hands of a just and righteous God. And everyone who has died is in the hands of the only one I would want to hold us as we are. But I also believe this. Christians believe that we await the resurrection of the body. Paul could not have been plainer. In Romans chapter 8, he says, we Christians groan inwardly as we await the redemption of our bodies. Please notice, it doesn't say redemption from our bodies. There's a reason for that. Your body is part of who you are. He makes this clear in the end of the first letter to the Thessalonians. Now may the God of peace make you holy in every way. I mean, all the way through. And may your whole spirit and soul and body be kept blameless until our Lord Jesus Christ comes again. He's trying to say, may you be found faithful. But he didn't just say you. The same God who wants to bring peace to every part of you, who wants to make holy every part of you, who wants to redeem every part of you, says, may your whole spirit be kept blameless, may your whole soul be kept blameless, and may your body, a blameless and holy body, until the Lord comes again. The spirit is going to be redeemed. The soul is going to be redeemed. And now I want to show you that according to Paul, the body will be redeemed. And this is such good news for anybody in this room who finds something about your body that's less than ideal. It is going to be changed. Paul spends over 50 verses in 1 Corinthians 15 trying to say two things. Number one, your body is coming up out of the grave. And number two, it's going to be changed. When it comes to our bodies and the future, there's a sameness and there is a strangeness. We're not talking about resuscitation, where God comes down to dead bones and pounds on the chest until the heart starts beating again. We're talking about a whole different form of life, and yet the same person. Paul says, when you plant a seed into the ground, what comes up? A plant. And if you go digging looking for the seed, you won't find it. You know why? You're looking at it. He says what you plant isn't what comes up, and yet what you plant is in fact what comes up. There's something different, and yet somehow there's something the same. That plant was somehow inside the seed all along. Paul says right now our bodies breed humiliation, but in the resurrection they're going to scream glory. Right now our bodies are corruptible, but in the resurrection they'll be incorruptible. So I'm going to be me, spirit, soul, and body, all working together, operating on all cylinders, but I will be incorruptible and living a new kind of life. So is there any pattern? Is there any image that I can think of to help me figure out what in the world am I going to be? In 1 John chapter 3, the writer says, beloved, we're God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared, but we know that when he appears, we shall be like him because we shall see him as he is. It was McGuigan who told the story I love telling. I probably have used it for 3 or 4 different sermon illustrations, but it's really good. That one day we're going to be in heaven and we're going to see the angels and they're going to be whispering and pointing at us, and we're going to shuffle over to overhear them because nobody likes to be whispered about and pointed at. And we're going to listen, and they're going to say, wow, doesn't he and doesn't she look just like Christ? This text says we're going to be like him, and that means a lot of things. It means a lot more than physicality, but it doesn't mean less than body. I know that because of the verse we read together. He will transform our lowly body to be like his glorious body by the power that enables him even to subject all things to himself. And when this happens, we will be naked and unashamed. But we live in the meantime. For now we wait. We live in malformed bodies. We live with arthritis and cancer. We live with aging and sickness. We live with situations that require surgeons or psychologists, and I don't have all the answers for all the difficult individual situations. We ought to be gracious. We ought to be sympathetic. We ought to be understanding. Every person wants relief from pain. We want to feel whole. Our soul cries out for alignment. It's what God always intended. But what do we do in the meantime? This picture is meant to describe a serious problem that was happening in the 1500s. The people were facing a terrible plague. It was called St. Anthony's fire, or ergotism. People had great sores breaking out all over their bodies in Isenheim. They'd run to the monastery of St. Anthony, and they looked for comfort and meaning. So when they arrived there, they found a portrait of Jesus that had been commissioned 11 years earlier. Commissioned to be a place where people who were hurting, whose bodies were wreckage, could look at this picture of Jesus and find hope. And what do you think that picture showed? They found a picture of Jesus with the same bodily sores. So that you could look at this picture and believe Jesus truly bore our infirmities and carried our sorrows. That he became like us in his death. But there's a second truth. When we gather, we give to each other. We say, take, eat. This is Christ's body. He became like us. And on Sundays, when we gather together and we eat the bread and we drink the wine, remember, he also becomes us as we become him. We become Christ to the world as God works with us, in us, and through us. And then we go around calling each other the body of Christ. I believe our bodies were made with meaning. I believe we have purpose. I believe they have a future. But if you can't find meaning or purpose in your body, find meaning and purpose in his body. As he calls us into his body, the body that provides for each other, that nurtures each other, that seeks to change the world, and that will be together forever with him. We believe in the goodness of creation. We believe in resurrection. And while we await, we find meaning and purpose in his story. I want to ask you this morning, do you find meaning and purpose in his story? You are wanted. You have been given a precious soul and you have a meaningful body, and Christ wants all of it. And he will give it back to you tenfold in glory. True story. Christians were being persecuted at the end of the 2nd century. Some of them were being thrown to lions. And the people who hated Christianity would make fun of them. One person even said, Christians are poop for lions. And in response, some early Christians said, the God who could make us out of nothing can remake us out of that. But my body belongs to the Lord.